Hello, my name is Evan Bordelon, and my book of choice was Animal Farm by George Orwell. Now, you might be asking yourself, Evan, why did you pick Animal Farm? Well, as I've gotten older and more in the know with politics, I've always been seriously impressed with how George Orwell's works, specifically 1984, have managed to still be relevant almost a century since they were first published. It was that exact legacy that persuaded me to read 1984 just last year, and I was a little disappointed by it, I'm not gonna lie to you. But I didn't want to count Orwell out just yet, and so I wanted to give another one of his works a shot. But the only other book I recognized in its entire bibliography was Animal Farm. And I figured, hey, since it's the only book of his that I have any sort of knowledge about, why not expand on that knowledge by finally giving it a read? But what is Animal Farm, you might also be asking? Well, in summary, Animal Farm follows a group of farm animals who become radicalized against the human race for being parasites, profiting off of their labor while receiving very little in return. From this radicalization, they overthrow their oppressive farmer overlords and aim to create a society where all animals have the right to live lives filled with peace, luxury, and equality. Now, if that sounds familiar, there's a very good reason as to why. Animal Farm was written to reflect the events that led up to the 1917 Russian Revolution and the rise of communism and the formation of the Soviet Union. And if you're familiar with any of that, you can probably guess where the book goes from there. They try to create a society with all that good stuff, and it goes about as well as the Soviet Union went. But how does Animal Farm go about telling you the story of Charlotte's Web, but with added famine? Well, Animal Farm is not very creative when it comes to how it tells its story. It's very direct and very straightforward, rarely ever bothering with imagery or emotional description, even in scenes where you might expect there to be. Now, that might sound a little boring, but I found that this way of storytelling was, oddly personal in a way, if that makes any sense. Because you weren't necessarily being told how to feel about what's happening to these characters, you were just being told what happened to them. I found that I had a lot more personal investment in these characters because I decided my emotions towards them and towards the events that unfolded upon them. But what exactly does Animal Farm have to say? Well, I found there was two themes that stood out to me the most. The first one was the power of propaganda. Now, in the beginning, Animal Farm was filled with a lot of bickering when it comes to how Animal Farm should be run and what's considered a priority and all that. And as time goes on, that bickering does start to fall, but not exactly for the right reasons. Not because any real agreements were met, but because they just kind of get squished under the massive arm of propaganda. This propaganda, often given in the form of speeches from the new regime, doesn't serve to reach any agreements or compromises as much as it serves to just redirect the opposition's energy to something that they already hate or fear. That way, the common people, they aren't paying enough attention, and the regime can basically get away with whatever they want. A good example of this that I found was this passage from the book. "Comrades," he cried, "you do not imagine, I hope, that we pigs are doing this in a spirit of selfishness and privilege. Many of us actually dislike milk and apples. I dislike them myself. Our sole object in taking these things is to preserve our health. The whole management and organization of this farm depend on us. Do you know what would happen if we pigs failed our duty? Jones would come back. Yes, Jones would come back. Surely, comrades," cried Squealer almost pleadingly, "surely there is no one among you who wants to see Jones come back." Now, if there was one thing the animals were completely certain of, is that they did not want Jones back. When it was put to them in that light, they had no more to say. The importance of keeping the pigs in good health was all too obvious. Now, the reason that Squealer over here gives as to why the pigs are getting most of the apples and milk is not a very good reason, and it's not going to convince anyone. So, Squealer decides to make the bold decision to just shift the public's attention to fear-mongering over the farmers that doesn't quell the opposition as much as it just moves it to something else that's tangentially related at best. Like I said before, this way the regime can just get away with anything they want under the guise of doing it for the people's sake. And yeah, that goes about as well as you think it might, because the second theme I noticed throughout Animal Farm was the corruption of democracy. Now, from the very start, the animals warned one another to never stoop to the level of humanity when it comes to how they treat one another. That is the very core of the ideology they dubbed animalism, which they break down into the 7 Commandments. But as the book goes on, those 7 Commandments of animalism quickly become muddied by those who want nothing less than absolute power. In the wake of this lust, animalism simply becomes an obstacle, one that must be dealt with in such a way that enables more control, but doesn't alert the masses as to what they're doing. And this is done through the gradual acceptance of human constructs previously considered contrary to the spirit of animalism, allowed by the new regime taking advantage of certain weaknesses that the public has. The best example that I found was from this passage. "At the foot of the end wall of the big barn where the 7 Commandments were written, there lay a ladder broken in 2 pieces. Squealer, temporarily stunned, was sprawling beside it, and near at hand there lay a lantern, a paintbrush, and an overturned pot of white paint. None of the animals could form any idea as to what this meant, but a few days later, Muriel, reading over the commandments to herself, noticed that there was yet another one of them which the animals had remembered wrong. They had thought the 5th commandment was, 'No animal shall drink alcohol,' but there were 2 words they had forgotten. Actually, the commandment read, 'No animal shall drink alcohol to excess.' Now, in case you're wondering, no, they had it right the first time. So, the commandments were quite literally being altered to justify decisions that would otherwise run contrary to them. Decisions that only serve to benefit those at the top and not the people. However, because the vast majority of the animals don't know how to read, many of them wouldn't be capable of noticing if the commandments were altered, and they would simply chalk it up to faulty memory. Animalism was being changed in ways the people had no means of really comprehending, and in ways that weren't meant to help them. And all of this culminates, in my opinion, with the third passage I chose. The Republic of the Animals, which Major had foretold when the green fields of England should be untrodden by human feet, was still believed in. Someday it was coming. It might not be soon, it might not be within the lifetime of any animal now living, but still it was coming. And this quote absolutely blindsided me when I first read it because it's seen at the very end of the novel, literally like 11 pages from the end. This was long after the rebellion, long after all the farmers were kicked off, and long after the animals spent years and years and years trying to make Animal Farm work. All of that was reduced to nothing because of corrupt individuals. They were right back to square one because of some animals that just wanted more power than the others. I think my biggest takeaway from Animal Farm was that democracy is a fight that never really ends. And despite being a novel that's meant to parallel events that transpired in Russia years ago, I think Animal Farm has just as much to say to Western democracies like us, even today. Getting to a point where the people can govern themselves without an absolute ruler deciding everything for them is great, it's incredible, but you can't stop there. It's all too easy to get on some kind of emotional high knowing you successfully overthrew some great evil, and that because you overcame that evil once, that means it's defeated forever and will never come back. As nice as it would be if it were, that just isn't true. There's always going to be people desperate and hungry for power for reasons we're never going to really be able to understand. And if we want to make sure everyone is treated as fairly as possible, we can't rest on our laurels. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep voting to make sure those pigs don't stay long. But yeah, that's all I really wanted to say. Thanks for listening.